In the summer of 1996, I was living in the small Alaskan bush town of Dillingham, a fishing village in Bristol Bay. I had woken up early on this clear, sunny morning and was waiting for my best friend Jason to pick me up. We were making a boat trip up the Nushagak River to the tiny village of Portage Creek. Jason was an outboard mechanic and had to go upriver to fix a boat and bring it back to Dillingham. After meeting up with Jason's girlfriend Vanita and our friend Seth and his black lab Fool, we were on our way. It was a beautiful morning and we were soon heading across Nushagak Bay and up the Nushagak River. Jason started drinking beer about the time we got underway and was at least mildly buzzed by the time we had made it the 40 or so miles upriver to Portage Creek. By about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Jason had repaired the outboard and we began transferring fuel and gear from one boat to the other. We didn't have much with us as we had not planned to do much else besides rescue the boat and maybe do a little fishing. Seth had brought along his 30-30 and we had fishing poles and gear and beer. Soon we were headed away from this last speck of civilization and away from the only phone for many miles around. That area of the world has very severe tides, frequenting between 20 and 30 feet. Consequently, the rivers are dramatically affected by this. You cannot make it up or down the Nushagak unless it's at high tide. Since high tide wasn't until 7 o'clock, we had over 5 hours to kill before we could go downriver back to Dillingham. We cruised around the river, fishing to pass the time. It wasn't long before Jason, who'd kept up his vigorous pace of Budweiser consumption, had passed out. We let him sleep while we continued fishing and buzzed around the river, viewing the Alaskan scenery and local wildlife. At 7 o'clock, Seth and I decided it was time to get downriver toward home. I'd told my wife we'd be home by 10 o'clock that night, and by our estimate, we would get there with almost an hour to spare. We had been going downriver for about an hour when the motor suddenly died. We steered toward land and beached the boat. Then Seth and I removed the cowling to see what we could see. As it turned out, what we could see amounted to nothing. We were baffled. It was time to wake up our passed-out outboard mechanic. After much difficulty, we roused Jason and pressed him into service trying to fix the motor. He crouched in the back of the boat looking at the motor and pressing the palms of both hands against the sides of his head as though he feared his head would split in half and tumble from his neck. While Jason toiled and groaned, Vanita began fishing again, and Seth, Fool, and myself explored our surroundings. The first thing I noticed about this strip of river bar was that it was completely covered in very large bear tracks. This made me very nervous, and I decided I was not very fond of this spot. Finally, Jason stopped tinkering with the motor and turned to give us his prognosis. I had my fingers crossed and was ready to go home. "It can't be fixed," he told us. "They're gonna have to rescue us." "Bull crap," I accused, hoping he was kidding but knowing he wasn't. "No bull crap," Jason said flatly. After about 5 minutes discussing what we were going to do, Jason decided he didn't care and went back to sleep in the small boat, still clutching at his head. While Seth and I discussed it, Vanita caught the biggest northern pike I've ever seen, which looked a lot to me like dinner. I cooked the fish on the fire that Seth had built. Everyone realized just how hungry we were as we waited eagerly, smelling the fish cook. We devoured a fair amount of the pike and burned the carcass in the fire when we were done, so it wouldn't attract unwanted visitors. We must not have been the only ones to smell the fish cooking, though, as about 10 minutes after it was gone, the first bear came ambling out of the brush, headed to the water. He was downstream of us and maybe 500 or 600 yards away. I wasn't too sure about our visitor, but Seth, on the other hand, was very excited and wanted to get a closer look. He walked down the river bar, 30-30 in hand, and dog trotting along at his side. He walked to within 100 yards or so of our visitor, and made a bunch of noise to announce our presence. The bear didn't seem too impressed, and wandered back into the brush after a few minutes or so. Seth and Fool returned to our camp by the boat, and Seth began excitedly telling us all about the bear. To my surprise, as Seth was talking, a very large bear, with a dark brown head and neck, stood up out of the brush, some 20 yards or so behind him. I jumped in surprise and yelled, "There's one right there!" Right about this time, the bears started coming out of the woodwork. In a matter of 10 minutes, a dozen bears had come out of the brush. There were 11 full-grown bears, one a mama with a cub. They all made their way down to the river. The salmon are thick that time of year, and I think we were in their favorite fishing hole. Now I was really nervous, and felt stupid for standing on this beach, as far out in the middle of nowhere as you can get, without my gun, in the Alaskan wilderness. We watched the bears for a long time, but for the most part, they were keeping their distance. It was probably after 10 at night by then, but we still had over 3 hours of light left. I spent much of that time gathering firewood and desperately trying to think up alternatives to staying here overnight. Short of swimming home, there were none. I kept a close eye on the bears, and wondered what my wife was doing, and hoping that I wasn't worrying her too badly. As I came to find out later, I was.
Hello? Search and rescue?
The night wore on. Jason and Vanita were now both asleep in the boat, while Seth and I carried on a very jumpy conversation around the fire, watching it get dark. It was sometime after 1 in the morning when the darkness finally caught up to us. The fog socked in and we couldn't see more than 20 or 30 feet in front of us. We threw more wood on the fire, and Seth and I decided we would rather stay up all night than be eaten in our sleep. We passed the time in conversation. I couldn't see the bears in the dark, and that gave me a sense of security. A false sense, perhaps, but I felt safer nonetheless. Then I heard a sound. I'd never heard this particular sound before, but I knew instantly what it was. Something big was running through shallow water, and it was coming straight for us. And I knew what that something big was. "Seth, there's a bear charging the camp!" I yelled in a panic-stricken tone, starting to move toward the boat. "No, dude, that's just the waves lapping against the shore." "Them waves been lapping all night. This is a new sound," I shouted back at him as I sprinted toward the boat and the source of the sound. Seth, realizing that I was right, ran over to the boat with me, his dog by his side, barking and whining, the hairs on its back standing straight up. There was a full-grown bear, charging through the water, coming straight for us. We were shouting at the bear, "Get out of there!" and "Yah!" Seth fired a couple rounds into the air. "Jason, get up! There's a bear charging the camp!" I yelled. "I don't care," moaned Jason. "Leave me alone." I pulled my head out from under the boat cover, and right at that second the bear stopped charging. Now only about 10 feet from us, it stood up on its hind legs and screamed. I had never heard anything more terrifying than the yell of that bear. My knees went weak, and I began to shake violently. Never in my life have I been more frightened than at that moment. After maybe 10 seconds, which to me felt more like hours, the bear stopped screaming at us, and dropped back down on all fours. It let out a brutish grumble and turned around slowly to amble away. The bear had come to say its piece. Now that it was sure we knew who the landlord was, it could leave. Well, as one might imagine, I was not too terribly overjoyed at the prospect of sharing this small strip of beach with an ill-tempered neighbor that weighed some 1,200 plus pounds. It took a good 2 hours for my heart rate to return to normal. Everything had calmed down, and we had tentatively returned to our quiet conversation around the fire, when the splashing sounds intruded once again. This time Seth needed no convincing. We once again rushed toward the boat and the sound of the bear. We did a repeat performance of the yelling, shouting, barking, and shooting. The bear rewarded our efforts with an encore of its own. It again stood up and roared at us. It seemed to be just as effective the second time around. I was horribly frightened and felt completely powerless. The bear was calling the shots, and it could easily charge in and kill us. Luckily, the bear was only there to give us an eviction notice, and once given, it plopped down on all fours again and wandered away. It took quite a while for our adrenaline rush to wear off and our hearts to slow down. We were not looking forward to an entire night of regular visits from the bear patrol. As it turned out, though, Fool was our only sentry for the last hour or so before dawn, as both Seth and I succumbed to the after effects of a fear-induced adrenaline overdose and apparently surrendered to unconsciousness. I must have toppled like a fallen tree because I don't even remember lying down. My next memory was of Jason kicking my boot. "Get up, the boat's fixed. It's time to go." He was apparently feeling no ill effects from his previous day's alcohol consumption. "What?" I said, surprised and angry. "That boat better not be fixed. If I slept with the bears all night for nothing, Jason, I'm going to kick your ass." Jason just laughed and told us that he woke up and was able to study the motor without the aid of beer goggles, and the problem had been easy for him to remedy. I didn't kick his ass. I needed him to drive the boat. And besides, I was too happy at the prospect of leaving. Needless to say, I wasted no time in loading up and shoving off. On the way home at last, to call off the search and rescue party my wife had organized. To this day, I never go anywhere without extra everything, from food and water to blankets and emergency supplies, and most of all, my gun. It was a terrifying and unforgettable night, but I came away from the experience with one hell of a story to tell my grandchildren.